Hi, I'm Mike Frisch, psychology professor at Baylor University. With me today is Dr. Ed Diener. This program is made available to the generous support of the Gallup International Positive Psychology Center. With 150 publications on the topic, Dr. Ed Diener, psychologist at the University of Illinois, is the world authority on human happiness. Dr. Diener, based on your groundbreaking research and knowledge of the field, tell us, what's your recipe for happiness?
I'm glad you said recipe. Sometimes people say, what's the key to happiness? And I say, well, there isn't a single key. So I don't like the key metaphor of, oh, if only you meditate or only you do this or that, you'll be a happy person. Instead, I like recipe because that implies that there's a number of ingredients you have to bring together in the right proportion. So what are those ingredients to make that cake we call happiness? The first ingredient, I think, is social relationships. Having people that love you, family and friends that love you, and having people that you love and that you want to do things for and take care of. For functioning adults need not only to be loved, but also to love. So that's the first ingredient. The second ingredient, I think, is a positive mental attitude, an approach attitude. So all of us in life have bad things that happen to us. But a person who's happy gets past those things, moves on, and they tend to focus on what's good about people and what's good about life. So, some people focus on, gee, everybody has got these problems or those problems. But if instead you think, gee, I have so much to be grateful for in other people. A third ingredient, I think, is realizing that maybe money is not the key. And some people put money first, and it's not that money doesn't count, but that money has to have the right place. And if you sacrifice social relationships, you're going to be in trouble if you sacrifice that to make money. Another one is having important goals and values that matter to you. So we all have to get involved in life and be active. And what I see with unhappy students tell me, gee, I don't have anything I care about. I don't have anything I really value. So you have to get involved and be active with your goals and things you care about. And the way I sum that up is, happiness is a process, not a place. So many people think, oh, it's a place. If only I get money, if only I get the right house, if only I get the right spouse, then I'll be happy. And sure, those things can count. But what's really important to realize is that you never get to that place, that there's always new things that give life meaning and importance, new goals that you're going to work for that are relevant to your values. So I'd say that's my recipe.
Well, it sounds like you're saying money can't buy happiness, but in looking at some of your own research, can we say that happiness can buy money or bring some kind of a...
Well, surprising you brought that up because so many people think that happiness is nice, it's its own reward because it's pleasant, it feels good to be happy. But we think it goes beyond that. Happiness is important not just because it feels good, but it makes the individual function better. So people who are unhappy, for example, are more likely to have unhappy marriages, to get divorced. Happy people tend to have better relationships. They tend to, on average, make more money.
Wow.
They volunteer more. They are rated higher by their supervisors. And lastly, they have better health and are more likely to live long. So happiness is a good thing to have.
Let me ask you this. What advice might you give people who are interested in a career in happiness research, quality of life, or positive psychology?
Yeah. The first thing I'd say is understand, this is, to me, the most important thing you could be doing, is understanding how to help people live a more meaningful, better life. So we've had so many advances in science, and science has changed the world, and it's helped us to conquer illnesses and so forth. But a physicist once said to me, the new frontier is psychology, because that's where we've lagged behind, and that's where we're going to help people really accomplish the things they care about that make life worth living for, that is, make life meaningful. And so when you get into this, you have to understand you're on a mission that's very important. And the second thing is, have fun doing it. It's like detective work. I love doing research. I wouldn't do anything else. I would do it if they didn't pay me. So understanding that research on well-being and positive psychology can be a fun thing.
And I guess we really need to try it out in order for the people to realize that detective fun nature to it.
Sure.
How do they get involved in research?
Sure. Try out research, take a course on research, work for a professor doing research, and see if it's for you. It's not for everybody, but if it's right for you, it can be very exciting.
And where do they find outlets for happiness or positive psychology research?
I think if you look around the United States and the world for professors who are doing it, and so all over the world, it's a growing movement, and more professors are involved in positive psychology. And looking for those individuals who might need to take on a new graduate student or research assistant and going to that place.
Well, thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you.
Hello, I'm Mike Frisch, psychology professor at Baylor University. With me today is Dr. Ed Diener and his wife, Dr. Carol Diener. With 150 publications on the topic, Dr. Ed Diener, psychologist at the University of Illinois, is the world authority on human happiness. Dr. Diener, can you tell me a little bit about your childhood?
Well, I grew up on a farm in California. We raised tomatoes, and so if you've ever had ketchup or tomato paste, it might have come from our farm. And there were a couple notable things. I was the youngest of 6 kids, so I had a lot of older brothers and sisters who took care of me. I was kind of a sickly kid for a while, and I stayed home a lot, so I read a lot. And one of the things I did that's kind of related to psychology is I used to play a lot with dice and cards. And that was because my parents used to occasionally play poker, and I started trying to figure out, well, gee, what are the odds of a pair? What are the odds of a straight? And so I played around a lot as a kid because I stayed home a lot sick with probability with dice and so forth. But I think that 2 things that probably shaped me the most as a kid growing up on the farm, well, I had a very stable, happy family, and so that was helpful, but that was a background factor, was number one, my mom was really into achievement, so I was in 4-H and Boy Scouts, and I was always trying to get the next award or the next merit badge. I gave a lot of speeches and went in a lot of tournaments, and so sort of became achievement oriented. And then I think the other thing was my parents really gave me a lot of freedom. So when I was about 12 years old, I got my own car, and I could drive around the ranch on the dirt roads, and I camped out with my friends, and a lot of times my parents didn't know where I was, and occasionally that might not have been the best, but I developed a sort of an independent attitude, and I think that helped me later to go my own directions. So those 2 factors, I'd say, were very big. Yeah.
What were your parents like?
My parents were very stable people. My dad didn't graduate from high school, but he was oriented toward education. He wanted all his kids to go to college, and he was a really hard-working, down-to-earth guy, admired in the community, and my mom was really achievement-oriented. Now, my parents moved from Los Angeles to the San Joaquin Valley as pioneers. This land had never been farmed, and they went there. It was in the middle of nowhere, 1930. They farmed there ever since. We still have the farm. And they were very stable people. Both my parents were really smart, and both my parents really were proud of me when I started achieving things. So I think it was a very supportive atmosphere.
What sparked your interest in psychology?
I went away to college, and I was majoring in agronomy, and that's the study of field crops. And of course, my dad wanted me to become a farmer. And I was bored with agronomy. You know, you watch plants grow, you harvest them, next year you plant them again. It seemed boring to me, so I never really loved farming. And I took a psych course, and I just found it fascinating. And then I took an anthropology course, and I found it fascinating. I thought, geez, this is really interesting stuff. This is really about life. And so I got excited about it, and that's really just the topic, just grabbed me.
Can you tell me a little bit about your experience in graduate school?
So after undergrad, I went to work in a psychiatric hospital for 2 years. And so I worked there for 2 years, mental patients and so forth, because I wanted to be a clinical psychologist. And during that time, what I found out is I'm not meant to be a clinical psychologist. What I really love is learning new things, reading books, and so forth. So I'd find myself at lunch every day in the library, and I'd spend a lot of time in the library at the mental hospital. And I liked reading about mental illness and so forth, but I didn't really like it. So when I went back to grad school, I said, okay, I'll go back and teach psych, and I'll get a PhD and then go to a teaching college. So I went to the University of Washington in Seattle. I worked with Erwin Saracen and Ron Smith and Scott Fraser, two personality psychologists and a social psychologist, and I absolutely fell in love with research. So I still like teaching, and I liked teaching then, and I think I'm reasonably good at it, but I really loved research. It just grabbed me, and I loved analyzing data. I loved writing papers. I just loved everything, hypothesis testing, everything about research.
And your first forays into academia or an academic job, what were those like?
So I applied around for a job, and of course, like everybody, you're a little bit nervous. And I applied to Harvard. Was actually my first job interview, and I went to Harvard and I was nervous, but I got the job offer there. But the problem with Harvard was Carol wanted to go to clinical grad school at this point. As I went to my first job, she wanted to go back and go to grad school, and Harvard didn't have clinical psych in those days. So we got a phone call from University of Illinois, and we said, where is that? And Carol got in grad school there in clinical psych. Let's see, let's look it up on a map, and you can maybe tell them the story.
In fact, at first you said you didn't want to come for the interview.
That's right.
And then one of your advisors said, please rethink that. This is a highly rated program.
Yes.
So we took a look at it. We had to find it on the map. Being Californians, we didn't really know about central part of the U.S. too much. And that's where we ended up.
So we went to Illinois, and that was 30 years ago. And it's a great department, and we love it there. And Carol's in clinical, and I'm in the social personality organizational program. And so it's been a great place for us. So
what was it like initially when you first came to Illinois in terms of setting up your research?
So Illinois is very supportive for research, and the first 6 or so years I did research on de-individuation, and that's about crowd behavior and losing yourself in a crowd. I did a lot of fun studies back at that time, and I went to South Africa, in fact, and testified in a huge crowd mob murder trial there related to my research, and this was back in the days of apartheid and so forth, so it was very interesting. But I finally, around 1980, and got tenure, decided, gee, you know, I'd like to study something more positive, and got out of the studying aggression and went more toward positive psychology.
Can you tell us more about how you got into happiness research per se?
So this was 1981. We had a sabbatical. Carol was teaching at the College of the Virgin Islands for that year, and I stayed home, and I was basically reading. And then I took care of the kids and read and was looking for a new area. So I looked at all different kinds of areas, behavioral genetics and different areas, to see what I thought could be a hot area. And I found this happiness, and very little research had been done. And I said, well, geez, what's more important than happiness? And I had always, even since I was an undergrad, wanted to do research on happiness, but I found there wasn't much research, so it just seemed like a wide open area.
Interesting. What's your perspective on this change of direction, Carol?
Well, it was certainly something he'd been interested in for a long time. Even we were married as undergrads, and even as an undergrad, he had proposed in a research design course to use happiness as a topic for a research design project, and his professor had said, you can't measure it, there's no reason to do research in there, forget about it. So I think he put it on the back burner, but I think it was always in the back of his mind that that was the area he really wanted to be working in.
And was there a particular aha moment when you decided on this sabbatical that you were going to forge ahead with happiness?
I think, I started reading Greeks, and I read the ancient Chinese philosophers, and I read religious people. I read all kinds of stuff about happiness. And there were so many hypotheses there. And then I started getting the journals and reading them, and I found, wow, there's some stuff around, some literature and research, but not much. I said, this is the most important topic and yet so little research being done. And so it was just very exciting.
Tell me about your experience then going back to Illinois and setting up your research program in happiness.
So this was around 1981 when we began doing research on happiness, and we started immediately doing experience sampling studies. So we were beeping people with alarm watches. The alarm watch would go off at random times every day, and we'd ask them to write down their mood. And I did it, and the grad students did it, and we had undergrads doing it, and then we started having actual subjects doing it that weren't working for us. And so that was our first study with about 40 people back in 81, where we were seeing, gee, when are people happy, who's happy, and we started looking at their personalities and so forth. Now, I was blessed in those years to have some great grad students. I had Randy Larson, Bob Emmons. These two guys have gone on to be great researchers in their own right. And so everything just came together, and we immediately started to publish in the area and studying mood and emotion.
This experience sampling idea, where did you get the idea of stopping people during the day to check on their mood and level of happiness?
Over time, people have been using experience sampling. Mike Csikszentmihalyi had used it in studies of flow. A psychologist, Dr. Brandstatter in Austria, had used it. So it's not clear if I had read about their work or we just thought about it separately, but somehow we said, gee, not just remembering how happy you are, but how happy are you? And we've got to capture that.
I'm intrigued in terms of how you may have managed your academic career, including this burst of creativity culminating in Diener 1984, your seminal review, how you balance that tremendous intellectual work with your home life and family life. Can you tell me something about that?
Well, we have worked hard, and Carol and I have worked hard, but I think we also do two things. We work and we love it, and we have our family. So we've sacrificed some things. And I think we don't have so many friends outside our family, and when our kids were growing up, we did lots of things with them. We always spent time with our kids. We'd spend the weekend with them, but we didn't watch television. We didn't waste time, so we were pretty efficient with our time.
Certainly think that's true, and I think it's really important to point out Ed was a very involved father. We had the twins right after finishing our undergraduate. We had Robert, our son, while Ed was in grad school. And then we started having some foster children and adopted children. So there were always a lot of kids in the house, always a lot of chaos, a lot of things going on, and Ed was always right there in the middle of it. And I think some of it was the enthusiasm, the energy that he brought to it, that he was able to do both, but he also makes decisions easily. He doesn't ruminate over things, very well organized, good time management. And we had a lot of fun with what we were doing, so I don't ever feel like he skimped on the father or husband role while he was doing these great other academic things as well.
Well, that's amazing. I think in many ways you seem to be trailblazers in that you've both been so involved in your family. In a positive psychology sense, you've given a lot to your family, and not only your own children, but you have some adopted children, I understand, and foster children. Can you tell us more about that?
Yes. At some point, I'm not even for sure what year we first took in some foster children, certainly after the sabbatical in the Virgin Islands, but we started taking some foster children and ended up adopting 2 of them and had some other foster children there over time. And child psychology is really my area, and I love kids. Ed loves kids. We just found them very energizing, so we spent a lot of time with them. A lot of times some of our graduate students, or Ed's graduate students, we sort of also adopted, I think, and it wasn't unusual to have them having dinner with us or spending time with us during the week either. So we've just always had a household of people that we've been comfortable with having around.
One of the things about our kids that I'll mention is 3 of them are teaching psych now. So our twins are both professors, and Robert's teaching social psych at Portland State. Our two adopted kids are not psychologists, so we joke around sometimes that maybe it's genetic, this interest in psychology. But anyway, so our kids share a lot of interest with us.
Can you tell us about the twins and where they've ended up?
So Marissa is a professor at University of Utah. She's a developmental psychologist. She does research on kids and parenting and temperament. Mary Beth is a clinical psychologist, and she teaches at University of Kentucky in Lexington. She teaches practicum students, that's grad students who are seeing clients, and then she teaches undergrad. So she teaches some of the same courses that we teach. She'll teach personality or social or human development and adjustment. So both of them have a lot of research interests. Now, Robert has worked with me for many years, and he's collected data all over the world. Robert is really an adventurer, and so although he's got a master's degree in psychology, Robert is a guy that loves to go to Africa, and he's collected data with the Maasai, and he's been branded by the Maasai as a man, and he's gone to northern Greenland and collected data from the Inuit. He's worked with the Amish. He's done research in the slums of Calcutta. So Robert is a kind of guy that can collect data where maybe some of the grad students wouldn't want to go. And so he and I have published the most together because we've collected so much data together.
It's really interesting because the twins, when they were little, they're identical twins, and we made great efforts that they would not grow up to be peas in a pod. Separate Girl Scout troops, separate piano teachers. I mean, just pressure to not be alike, and yet one's a developmental psychologist, one started out as a child clinical psychologist. That's about as similar as you can be and be slightly different. It's also interesting that we actually always switched them off compulsively. We had lists who was to take whom where, so that we were switching them around. And despite that, Marissa sort of identified with Ed and Mary Beth with me, and I don't think a coincidence that Marissa is the one who does research and Mary Beth is the one who does teaching, because Ed's the research in the family. I primarily do teaching.
Yeah, so they're following in your respective footsteps.
They really are.
I have a hunch that Robert's adventuresome spirit he may be a bit of a chip off the old block in that way. Is that right?
Well, I did do some adventurous things as a young man. I climbed the Golden Gate Bridge, for example, a couple times and got arrested once for it. And I did a lot of things like that. But also my family traveled a lot when I was a kid, and we traveled a lot with our kids. So when they were little, and I think Robert was 8 years old, we went up the Amazon in a canoe. Wow. We visited some Indian tribes. We went all over Europe. We went really all over the world with our kids, and so I think part of that was what Robert...
It never occurred to us not to do that. I think Robert was on a plane when he was 5 weeks old, and we liked traveling, and we just always took the kids with us, and so they all three grew up.
Well, it still seems remarkable to me that you had such a big family. You served the community through the foster children, the adopted children, and you accommodated really two careers as Carol got her law degree and clinical psych degree. How did you make time for all this and be such an eminent researcher?
I think we cut out the unimportant things. Our house isn't always as neat as it could be. We almost never watch TV. People say, oh, what do you think about this program or that program? And we just haven't seen much TV, to be honest with you. And Frasier, for example, people would say Frasier, and I'm like, who's Frasier? I've never heard of Frasier. And so there was, and Seinfeld, and there was places that we had to cut corners. And so I think the way we did it, we were productive in our careers, and we had 2 careers, and Carol went through both graduate school and law school. And so, we were busy, and we spent time with the kids, and I think we did it by being efficient and then cutting out things that aren't important.
I think there's also sort of a developmental trajectory there. I did not work full-time the whole time that we were raising children. I have a wonderful job that I sort of created. It's a non-tenure track teaching job, and I sort of announced to the department head every year, next year I can work 2/3 time, I can work 3/4 time, I can work half time, and it depended on if we were introducing a new foster child into the family. So I did not work full-time until on a regular basis. Some years I could work full-time because we weren't introducing a new child, but it just sort of depended. And Ed certainly probably didn't publish at the rate that he publishes now, where he's publishing 18 articles a year or something unheard of, when the children were little. I mean, he published, but not at the rate that he started publishing. I think when I started law school, we had only one child left at home, and I think at that point, everything ratcheted up a bit, or a lot.
For research.
For research.
Well, it's really interesting because he was, I don't know if you were aware then of Angus Campbell's research, but you had a kind of a balance, it sounds like, to your life that you don't always see in academics as successful as you are.
Right. I think it's possible to have that balance. And of course, academics can get caught up in their work, and it's good to be caught up in your work. But I do think it's important, not just for happiness, but for the world, and maybe even for your work, to have a bit of balance, especially when you're studying something like happiness. It's good to have balance.
And he certainly did. You were a basketball coach for Robert's basketball team. He was a Boy Scout leader. I was a Girl Scout leader. We were both on the Parents Club board. So certainly as active as any parent you would hope in the kid's life, in part because we enjoyed it. I think that was also very reinforcing. And when you're happy, it's his area, you're much more productive.
Very good, very good. So you're going to live in this stuff.
Yeah.
Let me ask you about, going back to the happiness research, did you run into any obstacles in pursuing this new
You know, when I
area?
first got into it, it was seen as a flaky area. It was seen as something, gee, happiness. If you studied depression, if you studied unhappiness, everybody say, oh, of course, that's what we're doing. We're studying all these problems. But studying something positive in those days was suspect, like, gee, this is kind of shallow or flaky. And so I was doing research, and it was getting published in good journals, and I came up for full professor, for example, to be promoted from associate professor. And there were people who opposed it. And they didn't oppose it because they hadn't published enough. They opposed it because they thought this area was kind of flaky and weird and wasn't a worthwhile area for psychologists. Now, the interesting thing, a lot of people just ignored it. So, you know, many people for the first 10 years just didn't know anything about my research. But more recently, let's say in the mid-90s or later 90s, all of a sudden, it's gotten to be a hot topic. Marty Seligman and positive psychology have really brought happiness research out in the open, and all kinds of research designed to study virtue and making life better. And so I think the positive psych movement is part of the reason, and I think there was also sort of natural interest in society. As America got richer and richer, people started asking more and more, not just, well, how can we get rid of these problems, but how can we lead a more meaningful, enjoyable life? And so I think that in the 90s, especially the late 90s, this whole area just exploded in terms of interest. And nowadays, people don't remember that in the 80s it had been kind of flaky in an off area. And nowadays, people think, oh yeah, of course, this is an important area. So it's really been a nice change for me.
Yes, from being a pioneer, you had some resistance to being recognized. Thinking back about your research program, are there any particular milestones that you see you could share with us? You spoke earlier about the beginning with experience sampling research and Bob Emmons and...
So I think that using experience sampling was a milestone in terms of a lot of the advances are methodological, and I think measuring happiness has been something we've been very concerned about, whether these measures are valid, and using multi-methods, so getting family and friends reports of the target person's happiness, getting experience sampling, getting some reaction time measures of happiness, self-reports, and bringing all those together. Now, one of my biggest papers was at the very beginning of my career. In 1984, I published a Psych Bulletin article that's been highly cited. And that was really a review of the whole area of well-being. And more than a review of what had been done and what had been thought, it sort of presented what are the major questions or approaches. And so it had a lot of influence on research because it would open up an area, like it would say, goal theories. We call them TLIC theories. Goal theories are about, gee, can people have happiness if they make advances in their goals no matter what their goals are? Is that true? And the importance of just having goals to life satisfaction. So I reviewed all of that in that article, and it had a lot of influence then on later research. So that was a big one. Now, if you move forward from 1984 to 2004, Marty Seligman and I just published an article, Diener and Seligman, and it's about psychological science in the public interest, namely about applying this stuff. And what we argue in that article is that we need national indicators of well-being. You could call them national accounts of well-being, just as we have national economic indicators, unemployment, GNP, interest rates. We would have those kind of indicators of well-being to track how the country's doing in terms of happiness, to see where the problems are, to see where we can improve, to see in the workplace who's happy and who's not, and who's really finding their jobs meaningful and fulfilling. And so we've recommended that, and part of the reason we recommended that is that we feel that economics gives part of the picture, but not the whole picture. And so by getting the well-being indicators, we could go beyond that.
It's almost as if you want to assess people's inner life, not just the money they're making or the widgets they're producing. Is that part of the idea?
That's right, and that would be the thing, and we would have national accounts of those, and maybe it would be on the TV up there with the Dow Jones average. But the idea
how happy people are,
how happy
general,
they would be, and how happy people are at work, and how happy people are in their relationships and in their marriage. And we'd want those indicators to go up too. It's nice that America is developing economically, but we'd like to make sure that it's developing in terms of people having a meaningful, engaging life as well.
Yes. Well,
Yeah.
it's quite amazing to me to think of these two seminal reviews, almost like bookends of your career at this point. You do this Renaissance man or person study in 1984. You're talking everything from Aristotle to the early research. What made you pick that? And then we go forward to Beyond Money, this incredibly detailed review of the literature and how we need to look at people's inner life and not just external indicators. Let's go back to subjective well-being, the seminal paper in 1984. Why did you use that term, subjective well-being, instead of happiness?
Well, happiness was suspect, and there's two problems with it. One is it could sound a little flaky. Subjective well-being, to be honest, sounded a little more scientific. And happiness can sound like you're kind of a smiley face, giggly sort of person. But I think the real problem with the term happiness for me is that it means different things. It can mean momentary mood, it can mean long-term satisfaction. So I wanted to avoid that term because it had a shifting sort of meaning. Yeah.
Taking a look at milestones between this seminal paper, I might also say that, for many people, a great researcher may have one or two good ideas, even a great man or woman in the fields of history, literature, psychology. So it's pretty impressive that you've got this long track record of research accomplishments. How would you fill in the details in terms of milestones between 1984, which was not your first research, but that seminal paper on subjective well-being or happiness, and Beyond Money?
Yeah. Well, let me just say, I don't think Beyond Money, the 2004 paper, is a bookend in the sense that it's the end.
Okay.
I sure hope not, because I hope to do a lot more research and a lot more scholarship in the next 20 or 30 years. And hopefully, as that happens, we'll move that bookend out and continue to add some papers and some books in there. So it's not the two bookends in the sense that now we've got the library, but
Yes.
we've got half the library.
Well,
the
forgive me. I said bookend in the sense that
Yeah.
this is 2004.
And we'll have
you've done
another
this
20 years, hopefully, of good research.
Yes.
But what comes between those two?
Just major milestones.
Yeah.
that you
So one of the things is our work on culture. So I've been blessed with having a number of students who are really interested in culture. Shige Oishi, Marx Christie Scullin, Chu Kim Prieto, and others. And they have really moved my direction towards, are people in some cultures and countries happier than others? And why? And why would that be? And furthermore, are the causes of happiness the same around the world, or do they differ in different cultures? And why might some cultures be a little less happy than others? So I think the culture thing has been very important and exciting and interesting.
Are there any findings there you'd like to share with us that have surprised you?
Well, one of the interesting things is that if you look at what predicts happiness around the world, living in a developed country helps, because if you live in a developed country, and by that I mean an industrialized country, you're more likely to live in a country where there's freedom, where there's human rights, where law takes precedence over a dictator controlling everything. And so those countries also have longevity. You find that people in those countries are happier. But the second finding is a little different, and that is that culture matters too. So for example, we find that Latin cultures are happier than you would think based on their income. So all over Latin America, Spain, Portugal, these countries come out a little bit higher than you would think they would based on the fact that their incomes are often sort of low to middling. And what it turns out is that these people value happiness, they think about positive things, they think in approach-oriented terms. We find other cultures that aren't quite as happy. Pacific Rim culture has been very critical, don't do the wrong thing, avoid making mistakes, and we find that people there in general aren't quite as happy. That's not to say they're unhappy and depressed, they're still above neutral. We find that most people around, and I think this is an important finding to mention, most people around the world are above neutral. The majority, 80% of people are happy. It's just how happy are they? And this is where the Hispanics and Latin Americans really sort of excel.
Very interesting.
Yeah.
Any other milestones in terms of
So
this,
another whole part of our research is about personality and what types of personalities are happier. Probably some amount of that is inborn. And so we find, for example, that extroverts on average are happier. People who are outgoing, leader type people, they're more sociable, on average are happier. We find that over and over in our research. So then the question came up, gee, is temperament all there is? Is really happiness just temperament? And you're either born happy or you're not. And there got to be more and more psychologists who are arguing that there's a set point and you're born with that set point, and that pretty much determines happiness for the rest of your life. So in the last few years, we've been examining that set point, and we've been saying, gee, are you stuck basically with your personality? And we find that that's not true. For example, we find that over a 17-year period, we followed thousands of people. 17-year period, about 1/4 of the people changed significantly in their set point. They moved up or down substantially from where they were. So yes, there is some truth to the fact that personality is important, set point's important, but there's also truth to the fact that if things go very badly or very well, or you develop some new attitudes, that your set point can change. So I would say that that is an important contribution where psychology can help people become happier. It's not like we're stuck from the very beginning. And then the last one that I'll mention that I think is progress is all these years we've been thinking about what makes people happy. And all of a sudden in the last few years we've started to say, but is it good to be happy? Do you function better? Or is there depressive realism? The depressed people are really better off. And so we've looked at it and we flipped it around. Instead of what makes people happy, we've started saying, but what happiness makes you do. And what we found is that happiness does seem to be a good thing. That is, it's not just that it feels good, but that it actually is functional. People who are happy, and I'm not meaning elated, you have to be kind of giggly and kind of on a high all the time romantically. What I mean is that you're in a positive mood most of the time. Those people tend to have better social relationships. They're more likely to get married, more likely to stay married, more likely to rate their marriage in glowing terms. Happy people are more likely to do volunteer work in their communities. Happy people are more likely to be leaders. They're more likely to be rated at work by their supervisors as doing a good job. We even found that happy people are more likely to make more money. It's surprising. Why? People like them, they're enthusiastic, they're energetic, they get up in the morning, they want to do things. And on average, it's not that every rich person is happy or that an unhappy person can't make money, of course, but on average you have a bit of an advantage. Now the last part of it that I think is very beneficial is that happy people seem to have better health and they seem to live longer, and that's very important.
Oh, very. Can I ask, among the very happy people, do they ever get down the dumps or frustrated or anxious or angry?
Yeah, I think it's a misconception that happy people just go around with this smiling face all the time and pretend to be happy even when they're not. Of course, even the happiest people get unhappy at moments. And when our mother dies, not only do we get unhappy, but we probably want that person to feel a sadness when somebody important dies in your life or you have a big failure. But the trick is, I think, that happy people tend to bounce back from that. So they react to events appropriately, but they don't dwell on that and get stuck in that, and then for the next 10 years, they're stuck in that state. So happy people, and most happy people are not at a 10 most of the time. Happy people are in a positive mood, sometimes slightly, sometimes moderately, and their moods vary in that range. They're not elated all the time, but they're happy 90-95% of the time.
And if they encounter some frustration, will they be unhappy like the rest of us until they work through that? Or
sure. Happy people, and we followed the top 10% of college students, for example, and looked at those people over time. And we found that all of them at moments would be unhappy. But for the very happiest students, they would bounce back. And for the very happiest students, they were in a happy mood most of the time when we would beat them at random moments. But occasionally, all of them would get unhappy under the right circumstances.
I think we could look at that as a milestone too, that particular study. Wasn't that the first study that you and Dr. Seligman did that looked at very happy people?
That's right. We did that, and we were really curious. Everybody wants to look at depressed people, and so we said, well, geez, what if you don't just look at what correlates with happiness? What if you go beyond that and say, take the paragons, the people who are really good at this, and find out what are they like, the super happy people. And so that was the point of that study, and we found out all of them had good social relationships. There wasn't a single exception. 22 happy people out of 222, the top 10%, not a single individual had bad social relationships in that top happy category.
That's amazing.
Yeah.
Now, any other findings with respect to how to be happy you'd like to share at this point?
Well, I think some of the important research is about goals and the idea that you need important goals to be satisfied. You need to be working on your goals. You don't just need to be successful. You need to have goals that you care about and that you're working on. And so some people think that happiness is only success when you get an A. But I say no, happiness is having things that you care about and working toward them. And I think that's an important insight. For people who are wondering about their life, don't just wait to get that A. Don't just wait to get that good job before you're going to be happy. You have to learn how to enjoy the process of getting there.
Okay, so
Yeah.
it's to some extent it's a byproduct of pursuing your most cherished goals, wishes, and values.
Exactly. And you know, the interesting thing is, for most people, happiness is not just feeling good, but it's feeling good for the right reasons. So we say to people, gee, if we could put your brain in a jar and hook it up to electrodes and make you happy for the next 60 years, and you'd be super happy, happier than you could ever be right now, would you want to do that? And almost nobody wants to do that. Maybe 1% of the people want to do that. Most people say, no, I want to be happy, but I want to be happy because I love my family. I want to be happy because I'm accomplishing things, because I'm going on vacations with people I love. They want to be happy. So you see, a lot of people think happiness is hedonistic. That is somehow, it's just pleasure and it's like getting drunk and all this. No, happiness is not hedonistic. Happiness is related to what you value, and the two come together, that the things that make you happy derive from your goals and values, and that in turn, happiness is a joint product then of both of these together.
So those advocates of hedonism, or what I call the sex, drugs, and rock and roll approach, is there any research that's not an avenue to lasting happiness?
No, we were recently looking at some data that were about short-term happiness versus long-term. So we asked, what makes for a good day? And we followed people over 52 days, every day, and this was over 200 people. And what made for a good day was interesting things happening and a lot of pleasant affect that day. So it was a little bit hedonistic in that the day felt good, it felt interesting. What made for long-term happiness was meaning and purpose. So do you feel like what you're doing is meaningful and related to your long-term values? But interestingly, what didn't predict either one of those was physical pleasure. So having a lot of sex and drugs didn't predict either one of those. Yeah.
How do those get emphasized so much then, you think, in popular culture? And
Gee, I don't know. I find that sometimes the media portrays the fun life as the good life, and it is good, if you can tie the short and long together. So I think of my dad as a farmer. Every day was a good day for him, or almost every day, because he loved what he was doing. He found it interesting. But at the same time, he was religious, and what he was doing as a farmer and in his job that he loved was related to the way he thought about God and the world. And so the long-term and short-term were tied together. And I think that's a key, that if you can bring both of those two things together. Now, for some people, having a lot of fun over here and then what's meaningful, and they're two different things and they're separate. And so I'd say to young people out there, how can you get a job that's not only meaningful, that will lead to the things you value, but also a job that you think is fun and exciting? And if you can then have the two come together.
Very interesting. Yeah. Any other milestones you'd like to emphasize up to this point in your research?
Well, I'm always thinking about what we're doing right now and the latest things. So right now I'm thinking about, are there optimal levels of happiness, and can people get too happy? And we don't know the answer to that yet. We do think that some super manic-y people might not achieve as much. They may have good social relationships in many cases, the super happy, but they may not achieve as much in terms of grades or making money and so forth. But that's a brand new area that we're working on that I'm excited about. And this, the limits of adaptation, there's something in psychology called the hedonic treadmill. And that means that no matter how hard you try, you can never become happier than your temperament. So you're running like a rat on a treadmill trying to be happy, but your temperament keeps bringing you back. And we've more and more been showing what the limits to the treadmill are. The first limit is most people are happy. They're not neutral. The second limit is your personality is important. It's not that we're all equally happy on that treadmill. But the third limit is the one I've already mentioned, and that is that some people can make their lives happier, or some people, unfortunately, can get unhappier in their lives. And so it isn't a treadmill. Now, are there adaptation things that do tend to bring us back? Yes, I think that was an important insight, but I don't think it's the whole story of happiness.
I see. What about circumstances and adaptation? Are we able to adapt to tragedies and traumas?
We find that people adapt to small things in their life. People get a raise at work. They get very happy. We had one young man in our study who was told, "You no longer have cancer." He had Hodgkin's disease. His mood skyrocketed. Of course, he overcame cancer. But in about 3 days, he came back to where he was before.
Wow.
So there are these adaptation things that influence a lot of what happens to us. And yet, there are some things that can make us go up or down and more permanently. For example, losing your spouse. We find that it takes a couple years to come back close to where you were before. Unemployment. If you really value your job, it's a deep part of your identity. It really hurts. And when you get a new job, it takes a while to come back to where you were before on average, because you feel scarred by the experience. We find that divorced people suffer, they go down, slowly over time they come back. So there's some things that can change your level of happiness. There are things that change your everyday life. They change the way you're living. They're not things like a raise. Oh yeah, you get a raise and it changes your life a little bit, but they're things that are really serious, big things like unemployment or widowhood. Now on the positive end, occasionally people will get married and they'll adapt and they're about as happy as they were before. But we find some people who are less happy than they were before. And of course they have a bad marriage. But we find a few people who get married and they adapt back, they get a big honeymoon high and they adapt back, but they never come back quite to where they were before. That is, they are for the long run happier than they were before they were married. So it's interesting.
What about these extreme traumas or extreme positive events like winning the lottery or having a major disability in a car accident?
Yeah.
Do we adapt to those perfectly?
Yeah, I think the answer about the lottery is that people probably adapt to it mostly, although maybe a few people who are poor to begin with are actually happier after the lottery. Okay. We don't have the complete data. We know the lottery winners are a teeny bit happier, but of course, since money is not the main predictor of happiness, we wouldn't expect winning the lottery to be big. Now, at the other end, I do think that there are some things that people can adapt to some extent, but what we find in our research is it does bring them down. Yes, having congestive heart failure that interferes with your everyday activities can make you less happy than you were before. Can you adjust and cope with it to some degree? Yes. But on average, are people a little less happy? Yes.
And when you say adapt, you're really speaking of going back to your usual level of happiness.
That's right. And of course, coping with things, thinking about it, developing a new sense of identity if you become disabled. We find with disabled people that some of them become very angry. And others would say, okay, I've got to adapt. I've got to come up with a new set of solutions in my life. Maybe I have to change my goals and change some of my goals and activities I'm doing. So people cope badly or well.
Mm-hmm. Well, it's interesting because it kind of goes back to your issue of goals and values. Perhaps when our circumstances change drastically, for example, we're too disabled as someone with quadriplegic disability, we can reformulate or redirect our goals and values and thereby hold on to some of that satisfaction or happiness.
Sure. So I think what you may keep some of your core values in place, but how you're going to get to those values may change. So over time, I as a researcher might change what I'm doing. And at some point, let's say I'm not quite as energetic or quite as sharp as I were before, maybe my contributions will change. And so that's what it is to cope and to understand that there's different ways to still accomplish your values.
Any other milestones you'd like to share?
Gee, I think that's the majority of them. Yeah.
What do you see, looking back, as your greatest accomplishments up to this point, both personally and professionally?
Oh boy, personally and professionally. Well, I'd say personally my greatest accomplishment, and I think it was probably sheer luck rather than accomplishment, was having a great marriage, having great kids. We've had a great family life. And
How
Carol
long
and I,
have you been married?
37 years. Wow. And we got married when we were 20. And I think we lucked out. And we
grew up together.
We've had one or two arguments in our whole marriage, little arguments. We never fight, and I think we just lucked out. And so that, of course, is the thing that I'm most grateful for. And our kids have turned out to be so rewarding. But in my professional life, I think the main thing is the realization that I brought happiness, along with some other people, to center stage in psychology. Many more people are studying it. So rather than specifically what I found is to make it a more popular area of research and also to set some of the fundamental findings. So we're still searching for the grand theory of happiness. We don't have it. But I think before you get the grand theory, you have to have some of the basic findings in place. It doesn't make sense to cook up, a lot of people can cook up theories, but how do we know if the theory is any good? And until we have, so we've really accumulated a lot of findings, I think, that'll be foundational and serve as a basis for later theory.
Yes, you were saying earlier how in terms of technology and physical sciences we progress so much, but we've kind of lagged behind in the happiness area. You've laid the groundwork in terms of some of the principal findings and methodologies that you've shared with us today. In terms of your life right now, can you tell us what gives you a sense of happiness or purpose right now?
Well, I still, the same things, our family, my marriage, our kids, and my research. But I have recently just taken over the beginning of a new journal, and it's going to be called Perspectives on Psychological Science. Now, I'm already the editor of one journal, and that is Journal of Happiness Studies. And we publish a lot of fun, interesting papers there. But this new journal, Perspectives on Psychological Science, will be a very broad journal across all of psychology, and I'll be the founding editor. It's just starting, and we'll publish large, big picture articles. So we'll publish big theories, big reviews, people's opinions and perspectives on the field. And the reason I love it is that it's going to give people an opportunity to take a chance and say risky new things. And at the same time, it's going to appeal to all of psychology. The articles will be written for all of psychology as a unified field. So it's not just social or personality or clinical, but we'll have psychologists from all different subdisciplines in there. And I think that it could become the most exciting journal. That's what I'm hoping for. It becomes the most exciting, interesting journal in all of psychology.
That's great. How about the future of happiness research? Do you have any, can you prognosticate for us on that?
The thing I love to see now is I've done a lot of research, and for a while I felt like, boy, I've got to research on this. Oh, I better over here, because I was one of the few people doing it. I felt like I had to do it all. And now all of a sudden I go to these positive psych conferences and so forth, and I see all these young people doing it, and they're doing some things that go beyond what we did. And I say, whew. Now, I can still continue to do the research, but there's so many people doing good research now. And these young people are sophisticated in terms of methods and statistics and the questions they're asking. So my prediction for the future is this is a hot topic. It's really going to make great progress. You know, when I got into it, I said, can we, in my lifetime, learn anything about happiness? Just one solid fact. And I actually think we've learned quite a few solid facts. And my prediction for the next 20 years, we're going to understand a lot more about happiness. Yeah.
Can you give some advice to these young researchers who are trying to sort of pick up the mantle and take the ball and run with it, so to speak?
I think a couple of things. One is persevere. It's going to take hard work over many years. I see people, they jump in, they think they're going to do one study and figure everything. Oh, wait, I want to do the study that figures everything out. No, it's going to take you 10, 20 years. Get in there. Stick with it, love what you're doing. It takes programmatic studies over time, but if you love what you're doing, don't think that you're going to solve it all the first year, but if you do another study that builds on it and so forth. So programmatic research. The other thing, don't get discouraged. We all get rejections from journals. We submit papers, sometimes they get in, sometimes they don't. You don't get discouraged, you keep coming back. And I've had 150 publications, you say, in this area. Well, then I've had 150 rejections. You have to keep coming back. The other thing is find a big, important question that you think, this is really important. No matter how hard it is to answer this question, this is an important question. And tackle that. And be willing to go in new directions. I see a lot of young people that want to come in, and 5,000 people are working on that topic, and they're going to be 5,000 number one, and I'm just going to add a little bit. You know, find a question that's exciting to you and is big to you, and it doesn't have to be a question that everybody's working on. It can be a question, and the people who have made really big contributions, I see a lot of times, are people who have said, hey, this is something new and interesting, and they take after it.
As you have.
Yeah,
thank you so
thanks.
much for your time, and Carol, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.